In the early summer of 1314, the air in central Scotland carried the weight of unfinished war. For nearly 2 decades, the struggle between the crowns of Scotland and England had reshaped the political map of Britain. Castles had changed hands, nobles had shifted loyalties, and entire districts had been burned in reprisal. But beneath the movement of armies and the proclamations of kings, something more fundamental was at stake: whether Scotland would exist as an independent kingdom or as a subdued province of England. At the center of this tension stood 2 men. One was Robert the Bruce, crowned King of Scots in 1306 under circumstances both desperate and controversial. His claim to the throne had ignited civil war within Scotland itself before he could even confront England. In the early years, he had known defeat, exile, and near collapse. English garrisons dominated much of the country. Scottish nobles had submitted to English authority. The cause seemed lost. The other was Edward II of England, heir to the formidable Edward I of England. His father had forged England into a military power feared across the British Isles. Edward I had invaded Scotland repeatedly, deposed its king, and treated the country as a conquered realm. When he died in 1307, the machinery of domination was already in place. But Edward II was not his father. His reign began with uncertainty. Noble factions competed for influence. Military discipline slackened. Royal authority, while still formidable on parchment, lacked the sharp edge it once had in the field. Bruce understood this weakness, and he moved with patience. Between 1307 and 1313, he did not seek open confrontation. Instead, he waged a calculated campaign of attrition. English-held castles were isolated and reduced one by one. Garrisons were harassed. Supply lines were disrupted. Rather than defend fixed positions, Bruce embraced mobility, striking where the English were thin and vanishing before a concentrated response could arrive. By 1313, the English position in Scotland had deteriorated dramatically. Only a handful of major strongholds remained in English hands. Among them, one towered above the rest in both symbolic and strategic importance: Stirling Castle. Stirling was not merely another fortress. It guarded the primary route between the Scottish lowlands and highlands. Control of Stirling meant control of movement, taxation, and military access. Its loss would signal not just tactical defeat, but crumbling of English authority in Scotland. In 1313, Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce, laid siege to Stirling Castle. The English commander inside negotiated a conditional surrender. If the castle were not relieved by Midsummer Day of 1314, it would yield to the Scots. This agreement was both bold and dangerous. It gave England a deadline. Edward II could not ignore it. If Stirling fell without resistance, the humiliation would be immense. English prestige, already fraying, would suffer a blow difficult to repair. Worse, the political consequences within England might embolden rivals who questioned Edward's competence. So Edward II resolved to march north. The army he began assembling was the largest England had fielded in Scotland for years. Feudal levies were summoned. Knights gathered with their retinues. Archers were called from the shires. Supplies were organized for a campaign expected to be decisive. On paper, the imbalance was overwhelming. Estimates vary, but Edward's force likely numbered between 15,000 and 20,000 men, perhaps more. Heavy cavalry formed an elite corps. Armored knights mounted on powerful destriers, trained to break infantry formations through sheer shock and momentum. Supporting them were thousands of infantry and longbowmen. Bruce, by contrast, could muster perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 men. His strength lay almost entirely in infantry, spearmen organized into dense formations known as schiltrons. These were not the loose circular defensive rings of earlier Scottish defeats. Under Bruce's reforms, they had become mobile, disciplined blocks capable of advancing as a unit. Still, the disparity was stark. If Edward's cavalry could deploy properly on open ground, the Scots risked annihilation. Bruce knew this. He did not intend to meet the English where they were strongest. Throughout the spring of 1314, he studied the terrain south of Stirling. The area around Bannockburn, a winding stream cutting through marshy ground and patches of woodland, offered possibilities. The new park, a royal hunting preserve, was thick with trees and uneven earth. To the east lay the Carse, low-lying and prone to soft footing, movement that could become chaotic if compressed. Bruce was not seeking glory. He was building a trap. He ordered concealed pits dug along likely cavalry approaches, disguised with brush and light soil. He positioned his forces where trees and watercourses would restrict English maneuverability. He intended to narrow the battlefield, to deny Edward's army the room required for a coordinated charge. But strategy on parchment rarely survives first contact. There were risks. If Edward chose a different route, if the English advanced cautiously, if their archers established dominance before the cavalry committed, any one of these variables could unravel Bruce's design. Meanwhile, Edward II's march north was not swift and disciplined, but heavy and deliberate. The sheer size of the army slowed it. Supply trains stretched long across the countryside. Noble contingents traveled with banners and household guards, each commander conscious of status as much as strategy. Edward's decision to lead personally was politically necessary. It projected authority. Yet it also placed immense pressure on him. A king present at the battlefield cannot easily retreat without reputational cost. By June 1314, both armies were converging on Stirling. Inside the castle, the English garrison waited. Outside, the Scottish army assembled quietly in the woods and along the narrow approaches south of the River Forth. For Bruce, defeat would mean more than battlefield loss. It would invite renewed English occupation, perhaps the collapse of his fragile kingship. Many Scottish nobles had only recently committed to his cause. Their loyalty was not guaranteed beyond success. For Edward, failure would confirm suspicions that he lacked his father's command ability. It would weaken him at home and embolden enemies abroad. Neither man could afford humiliation. On June 23rd, the English vanguard approached the Bannockburn. The landscape was deceptive. From a distance, it seemed open enough. Gentle slopes, patches of grassland, scattered woods. But the ground underfoot was uneven, cut by hidden depressions and damp stretches that could swallow the momentum of charging horses. Bruce deployed his army in 4 divisions. 3 schiltrons formed the main line, each commanded by trusted lieutenants, Thomas Randolph, James Douglas, and Edward Bruce. A reserve stood ready behind them under Bruce's direct oversight. The Scots waited largely out of sight. The English did not expect a fully formed battle that afternoon. Many assumed the Scots would avoid direct engagement until the following day. Some believed the mere sight of England's massive host would scatter Bruce's men. But Bruce had chosen the ground, and he had chosen the moment. As the English vanguard pushed forward, skirmishing began near a narrow crossing. Confusion rippled through the English ranks as units attempted to deploy in constricted space. Orders struggled to travel across the crowded field. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of withdrawing into the trees, the Scottish schiltrons advanced. It was a calculated assertion of resolve. Dense ranks of spears angled outward, bristling like moving hedgehogs of steel. They did not run. They did not disperse. They stepped forward in cohesion. For the English knights at the front, the sight was unsettling. Heavy cavalry relied on breaking infantry formations through shock. But shock required speed. Speed required space. Here, space was vanishing. The first collisions were chaotic. Horses balked at the forest of spears. Riders attempted to wheel and regroup. Units pressed forward from behind, unaware of the congestion ahead. In the tightening field near the Bannockburn, the enormous English army began to compress against itself. And Bruce, watching from behind his lines, understood that the trap was beginning to close. By the afternoon of June 23rd, 1314, the approaching English army was no longer an abstract threat on the horizon. It was a living mass of men, horses, banners, armor, and expectation pressing into a landscape that had already been chosen against it. Edward II's force was vast by the standards of the British Isles. Thousands of infantry, contingents from across England and Wales, and the mounted elite of the realm. The core of his power lay in his heavy cavalry. Armored knights trained from youth for the decisive shock of the charge. These men were not merely soldiers. They were the military aristocracy, accustomed to breaking opposition to momentum and status as much as steel. Yet they were entering ground that did not reward their strengths. Robert the Bruce had assembled a far smaller army, but it was cohesive and hardened by years of irregular warfare. Most of his men were infantry drawn from the Scottish lowlands and highlands, farmers and townsmen shaped into disciplined spearmen. The Chiltern formations they formed were no longer static defensive circles, as at earlier Scottish defeats, such as Falkirk. Under Bruce's guidance, they had evolved into compact, rectangular blocks capable of advancing and maneuvering while maintaining dense ranks of outward-pointing spears. Each man's survival depended on the steadiness of the men beside him. Panicked by one could unravel dozens. Discipline, therefore, was not abstract virtue but immediate necessity. The terrain around Bannockburn was a silent participant in the coming clash. To the west lay the New Park, a wooded royal hunting ground whose trees and uneven clearings fragmented visibility. To the south and east stretched low, marshy ground where heavy horses could lose footing. The Bannockburn itself, though not a vast river, cut irregular channels through the field, creating natural choke points. Bruce had studied these features carefully. He did not seek to annihilate England in open battle. He sought to deny England the conditions in which its superiority mattered. By narrowing the approaches and constricting deployment space, he forced Edward's larger army into a compressed frontage where coordination would falter. On that first day, engagement began almost unexpectedly. An English cavalry detachment under Henry de Bohun advanced aggressively, perhaps believing that the Scottish line was not fully formed. In one of the most remembered moments of the battle, de Bohun rode directly toward Bruce himself, who was mounted lightly and armed with a battle axe. Contemporary chronicles describe how Bruce held his ground until the last instant, then sidestepped and struck de Bohun down with a single blow. While later retellings have romanticized the scene, its psychological impact cannot be dismissed. The Scottish king had faced down a charging knight and survived. For his men, it reinforced resolve. For the English front ranks, it was an early signal that the Scots would not dissolve under intimidation. As the English vanguard pressed forward, congestion quickly became apparent. Knights eager for engagement found their movement restricted by trees and soft ground. Units behind them continued to push, unaware of the bottleneck ahead. The Chilterns, advancing in tight cohesion, met the cavalry not with scattered resistance, but with a bristling wall of spear points. Horses, highly trained though they were, hesitated before impaling themselves. Some crashed into formation and were killed. Others swerved, disrupting the formation of riders behind them. Momentum, so essential to cavalry dominance, bled away in the confined terrain. Edward II faced an immediate problem of command and control. Medieval armies lacked modern communication. Orders traveled by shouted command, banner signals, or mounted messengers. In compressed ground, visibility was obstructed and noise overwhelming. The English army, larger but less centralized in tactical doctrine, began to operate in semi-independent clusters. Individual nobles sought honor and breakthrough, sometimes without awaiting coordinated instruction. This fragmentation amplified the disadvantage of space. Instead of delivering a unified blow, the English attacks came in waves that collided with disciplined Scottish blocks. The first day's fighting did not produce decisive annihilation, but it set the psychological tone. The Scots had held their ground. More significantly, they had advanced into the English rather than merely absorbing attack. As evening approached, Edward's army had not cleared the field nor relieved Stirling Castle. The realization that numerical superiority had not translated into dominance unsettled morale. Within the English camp, debates emerged over positioning and strategy for the following day. Some counseled caution, suggesting redeployment to more favorable ground. Others pressed for renewed assault at dawn to avoid the perception of hesitation. Bruce, meanwhile, recognized that the coming morning would determine everything. His army had performed beyond expectation, but fatigue was real. Casualties, though lighter than those of the English cavalry, had thinned ranks. Night offered little comfort. Men slept on tense ground, aware that a massive host stood only a short distance away. Yet Bruce understood that time favored him. The longer the English remained constrained near the Bannockburn, the more their size became liability rather than advantage. At dawn on June 24th, the Scots advanced again. This movement was deliberate and unified, rather than waiting passively. The Chilterns stepped forward in 3 primary divisions, their spears angled outward and slightly upward to deter mounted penetration. The advance itself was psychologically potent. Medieval infantry typically feared cavalry. Here, infantry pressed toward mounted elites. The English, forced into defensive posture within limited space, struggled to deploy their archers effectively. Longbowmen, potentially decisive if granted clear lines of fire, found their arcs obstructed by their own cavalry and terrain. Attempts to position them on the flanks were constrained by marshy ground and woodland. As pressure intensified, English knights launched renewed charges. Individual acts of bravery were numerous, but bravery could not compensate for physics. Charging horses slowed on soft ground. Impact against the schiltrons lacked cohesive force. Once unhorsed, knights in heavy armor found movement difficult in mud and crush. Scottish infantry, wielding axes and short blades, exploited these moments with grim efficiency. The battle degenerated into close-quarter struggle where numerical superiority offered diminishing returns. Edward II's command position became increasingly precarious. Observing the inability of his cavalry to break the Scottish line, he faced a narrowing set of options. Withdrawal would concede the field and doom Stirling Castle. Continued assault risked entrapment as his own forces compressed against the Bannockburn and the River Forth. Reports of congestion and mounting casualties filtered through fragmented channels. The sheer density of men and animals created chaos. Fallen horses became obstacles. Panic in one section rippled outward as soldiers sought space to breathe and maneuver. Then an unexpected element compounded English anxiety. Camp followers and non-combatant attendants from the Scottish rear reportedly emerged onto elevated ground behind Bruce's lines, appearing as additional forces arriving to reinforce the Scots. To exhausted English troops already uncertain of their position, the sight suggested fresh enemy reserves. Whether militarily significant or not, the psychological effect was immediate. Perception of encirclement intensified. At this stage, the battle was no longer a contest of initial plans, but of collapsing structure. English units near the front, pressed by advancing schiltrons and unable to retreat easily due to congestion behind them, began to break formation. Some attempted to flee toward the Bannockburn crossings. Others veered toward the open carse, only to encounter marshy impediments. In dense medieval battlefields, retreat often transformed into rout with alarming speed. Once the collective confidence that held formation together dissolved, individual survival instincts dominated. Bruce's leadership during these critical hours was marked by restraint rather than reckless pursuit. He maintained cohesion among his divisions, preventing overextension. The objective was not heroic charge, but sustained pressure. Each step forward reduced English maneuver space further. The trap he had designed through terrain selection and disciplined infantry now tightened through psychological collapse. Edward II eventually recognized that his position was untenable. With portions of his army disintegrating and personal capture a genuine possibility, he withdrew under guard towards Stirling and then southward. The departure of the king signaled to remaining forces that organized resistance was ending. What had begun as the most formidable English expedition in years was dissolving into fragmented escape. By midday, the field belonged to the Scots. Yet the significance of that ownership was only beginning to reveal itself. The destruction had not been a single catastrophic charge, but a gradual constriction of advantage. Space denied, momentum blunted, confidence eroded. Bannockburn was demonstrating that medieval warfare was as much about controlling environment and morale as about counting numbers. And as the English host fragmented across the Scottish countryside, the consequences of that realization were already reshaping the balance of power on the island. By the afternoon of June 24th, the full weight of what had transpired at Bannockburn began to crystallize for both armies. The English host, despite its size and prestige, had been corralled, fragmented, and psychologically destabilized in a manner few commanders could have anticipated. The terrain, once merely a passive stage, had become an active participant, shaping the outcome as surely as spears and swords. Horses mired in marshy ground, armored knights trapped against the Bannockburn, and dense infantry formations moving with deliberate cohesion combined to nullify the numerical and technological advantages the English had relied upon for decades. Edward II, increasingly aware of the impossibility of a decisive breakthrough, faced a choice between attempting another assault under worsening conditions or withdrawing entirely. To remain was to risk not only the annihilation of his army, but the capture or death of the king himself, an outcome that would have reverberated through England with political shockwaves far exceeding the battlefield. As the English forces hesitated, the Scottish army maintained a disciplined pressure. Bruce's schiltrons were advancing slowly but inexorably, a steady wall of pointed spears and tightly packed infantry that left little room for maneuver. The Scottish divisions were supported by lightly armed troops who harassed the English flanks, disrupting attempts to redeploy and exploiting any weak points exposed by the compressed formations. Every fallen knight and collapsed horse compounded the confusion behind the front lines, creating choke points that further restricted movement and amplified the sense of imminent collapse. Communication among the English was nearly impossible. Banners could not be raised effectively through the massed lines of men and horses, and messengers struggled to navigate the congested battlefield. Commands were delayed, misheard, or ignored entirely, creating gaps and overlaps in deployment that Bruce exploited instinctively, never losing control of his formations, never overextending his reserves, and always observing the battlefield from positions that allowed him to intervene where necessary. The collapse of English morale was not sudden, but it was inevitable. Once the initial shock of encountering the advancing Scottish infantry had been absorbed, individual knights attempted to act independently, seeking isolated breakthroughs or retreat paths that promised personal survival. These efforts, however courageous, were ill-coordinated. The congestion of the battlefield meant that one knight's maneuvers could impede another, and the tightly packed mass of cavalry behind only intensified the chaos. Horses stumbled over the bodies of fallen men and animals. The mud of the Bannockburn banks slowed advance and retreat alike, and longbowmen, though trained to deadly effect, could not operate effectively in such constrained conditions. Every moment reinforced the Scottish advantage. It was no longer a question of who possessed greater numbers or heavier armor. It had become a contest of order versus chaos, discipline versus panic, and Bruce's forces maintained the former with remarkable steadiness. Edward II's own position was increasingly precarious. As king, he was responsible for the cohesion and safety of the army, yet every command he issued was filtered through layers of obstruction. Noble contingents, each with their own agendas and notions of honor, were prone to act independently, pressing forward where they might have been held back, retreating where they might have advanced. The sheer size of the force, once a source of confidence, now worked against them. Units became trapped against the Bannockburn or against one another, unable to deploy effectively, and increasingly aware that the Scottish infantry was not retreating, but advancing with calm precision. Reports of fallen knights, captured men, and the unexpected presence of Scottish reserves behind the main line intensified the sense of encirclement. Edward's authority, dependent on visible control, was eroded with every faltering charge and every failed maneuver. By mid-morning, it was clear that the English army could not regain the initiative. The psychological dimension of the battle now became decisive. Medieval warfare relied heavily on perception, on the morale and expectations of soldiers and their leaders. A retreating knight could signal weakness to others. A charge blocked by infantry could suggest futility. For hours, the Scots had advanced with steady confidence, projecting unity and inevitability. The English, conversely, were trapped in an environment that magnified their vulnerabilities. The combination of constrained space, natural obstacles, and disciplined opposition created a feedback loop. Each failed maneuver reinforced doubt. Each miscommunication heightened fear, and each visible collapse of one segment of the army increased the likelihood that others would falter. By mid-afternoon, these forces coalesced into a near-universal understanding across the English ranks. The battle was lost. Bruce, fully aware that prolonged engagement could still exact a cost from his forces, chose to consolidate his advantage rather than pursue reckless slaughter. He ordered his divisions to tighten the schiltron formations and push forward slowly, maintaining the pressure but avoiding overextension. Where English units attempted to regroup, Scottish forces applied measured harassment rather than committing to frontal assaults that could invite counterattack. It was a masterful exercise in controlled aggression. The Scots were now in command not only of the battlefield, but the tempo and psychological tone of the conflict. Every movement reinforced the inevitability of English defeat, without unnecessarily exposing the Scots to risk. They were exploiting advantage rather than seeking glory, a disciplined calculation that would magnify the effect of their comparatively smaller numbers. The turning point became evident when Edward II attempted a coordinated withdrawal towards Stirling Castle. What should have been a controlled repositioning devolved rapidly into disarray. Cavalry columns collided with infantry, trapped against a burn, or attempted to skirt obstacles that proved impassable. Isolated groups were cut off, surrounded, or forced to surrender. Panic became contagious. Where once numerical superiority could have been decisive, the English found themselves hemmed into narrow corridors, unable to deploy effectively and unable to retreat without significant losses. The Scottish army, compact and cohesive, maintained pressure and blocked key avenues of escape, ensuring that the English perception of encirclement became a reality. At this stage, the battlefield itself seemed to conspire with the Scots, converting every natural feature into a weapon and amplifying the effects of disciplined infantry against a larger, disoriented foe.